It's difficult to see Trump again in that kind of world, in that dynamic.
You think so? You don't think he can pull it out?
I mean, you're more in tune with American
Politics
than I am, so like.
I mean, if I would vote for anyone, I'd probably vote for Trump, mainly because he brought peace to the Middle East, right? I mean, say what you want, but we had peace.
It depends what you define as peace, my friend. Depends on
much
peace,
better than under Bush and Obama. You go to the Bahrain pavilion? Did he go? First of all, did he go? Yeah, you did.
Yeah.
Did he go to the Bahrain one?
Yeah, of course.
That was a weird one, right?
It depends which month you went.
Okay.
Because it changed every month.
Really? I didn't know that. The one I did, they had like everything was like made out of aluminium sheets.
Ooh, was that the one where it was the car as well that was there?
There was no car when I went.
Okay.
It was just, the inside was everything aluminium.
But then what was the exhibit?
Pearls.
It was the pearl one. Okay.
Yeah.
So you went at the very beginning.
Yeah.
Then okay.
And I was like, when I saw the aluminium, I was like, Alba, of course, of course.
It changed every month inside, depending on kind of the themes. They had the pearling. They then had like the automotive industry that was highlighted. They had the culture industry, the arts industry, business. It changed. It changed quite frequently.
I mean, when I went there, it was so packed, and I remember just crowds and crowds of people. And
I would have been October. You would have gone October, November.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact month.
Yeah.
I just remember walking past Japan's like thing, and it was just China and Japan were next to each other, which I thought was weird. Then it was next to the US as well.
Yeah. It was a funny, because I was there I went for the first week, and it was interesting to see like the memes of the pavilions start to like go, because when I went first day, Japan was empty. More people went to Japan. You start to hear like the whispers, oh, Japan is amazing, Japan is amazing. And then you start to see the line kind of get longer. Then you see like someone tweet about it, post on Instagram, and then by like the third week, you could see it kind of in real time get famous.
It was surprised me because in the US pavilion, they had a SpaceX rocket.
Yes, they did.
And not NASA, which I thought was really telling.
It did. Yeah.
I wonder how that marketing, how that happened.
It was because the pavilion was the Trump administration designed it.
Really?
Because it happened before. It was supposed to happen, obviously, the year before. And it was Trump's kind of admin and under their leadership that they designed it. So it was a Trump
Do you think
decision.
Trump is going to become back into power?
It's looking unlikely, given how the court cases are going. I mean,
it's difficult to say, right? If it's because I don't think Biden is in for a second term. I think he fucked up too big.
I mean, it doesn't look like it's Trump, and also it was interesting even with Brazil. Bolsonaro lost yesterday, and I think that kind of politics is no longer a winning politics.
It's hard because I think people are really. I mean, that's the dialogue that I'm hearing. I hear a lot of people being very upset with what happened with the Biden administration.
Yeah.
I mean, the rhetoric I'm hearing right now, especially with the Sardia cutting, was it 2 million barrels a day with OPEC, and that the U.S. have said like we're gonna reevaluate our relationship with Iran, which is like such a telling thing. And mashallah, MBS said, we want to have a European Union of the GCC, including Yemen, including Iran, which is amazing.
Yeah.
And and now Saudi, I think they just said they're looking into joining the BRICS nations, so it would be the S, I guess.
Yeah.
So it's a telling time. It's really, really changing.
It's fascinating. It's happening. It's difficult to see Trump again in that kind of world, in that dynamic.
You think so? You don't think he can pull it out?
I mean, you're more in tune with American
politics
than I am, so like.
I mean, if I would vote for anyone, I'd probably vote for Trump, mainly because he brought peace to the Middle East, right? I mean, say what you want, but we had peace.
It depends what you define as peace, my friend. Depends on
much
peace,
better than under Bush and Obama.
That's not a high bar.
Come on, you're being cruel.
It's not a high bar. It's not a high bar.
I think he managed to. What was it? I think the first president who met with Sheikh Khalid, not Khalid, was not Theodore Roosevelt. It was Roosevelt. In 1947, he met Malik Faisal. So that was the first time the U.S. and Saudi ever sat together.
Yeah.
That was in 1947. And that was, I mean, Roosevelt really, really believed in Saudi. He believed that Saudi could be a pathway for stabilization in the region. And I think we did good effort and a good job, but I think the U.S. has a lot of time undermined some of these things, right? So I don't know. I think Trump, if he would run, he would probably win with a large margin. If I was a betting man, I would bet on that.
And do you think he'd be allowed to run?
I think if we wouldn't be, there would be riots on the streets. I don't think there's. I think there's so much. It's like a pressure cooker, and there's so much pressure right now in there. And especially, this has never happened in U.S. history that a former president was raided by the FBI.
Yeah,
this is unheard of, uncharted territory.
Yeah,
right. And that's such an overreach from a government perspective.
Is it
for a president?
Given what he.
Supposedly, the January 6th riots?
I mean, between that and the documents that he had.
But he's allowed to keep it. He's the president.
That's their argument that he's not. At least not in Mar-a-Lago.
That's a debate on itself, right? Yeah. Because as long as that office or that residence is used for presidential work or registered as such, he has security clearance. You can't take that away. That's for life, right?
You should be on Trump's legal team.
Yeah.
Try to make the case for him.
I think, you know what? I don't know. I don't know. I don't think what Biden has done for the region or what has done policies has been good globally or
I mean, it's the extension of Obama's policies. It wasn't great for the Middle East.
I mean, we can even look at what's happening with the gas and oil prices in Europe, right? The U.S. put the restrictions on, and Europe is suffering for it, which is, which is and they're looking at what other gas lines, and China and Germany have recently sat down and said, hey, we want to see each other more as competitors rather than opponents. That's also a very telling sign of Europe.
Yeah. Are you thinking of going back to the US on kind of election season?
Well, just to do a podcast and check out what's going on with those people down there?
Or just to kind of be there, and the Arab community there as well, and their views and.
Yeah, but I've never felt that the US has been very friendly to the Arab community. Right? I mean, my dad has been stuck at airports for 12 hours. I've been personally stuck at airports, and that was when I was still a student. Yeah. Right.
So when were you in the US? Did you?
In 2016 till about 2019.
Okay,
and I was
the Trump era.
Trump era, and I was also there before.
Okay.
During the post 9/11, which was a very.
My sister was living there at the time as well. In New York.
That was very difficult.
Yeah.
I mean, I will never forget.
And you grew up there then? You went to school in the States or?
No, I studied in the UK mostly.
Okay.
Right. So I got the accent from TV. Most people ask me about it, yeah. What about yourself? You studied in?
Schooling in Bahrain and then university, UK and beyond.
You went to St. Christopher, right?
Yeah.
And then you went to the UK?
I went to UK. And then had a interesting kind of journey then I did kind of different masters and programs in the US.
And how did you find it living there from an Arab perspective?
In the UK?
In the UK and the US.
I mean, the US was always more transient, in and out. The UK, I enjoyed it. I really loved my time there. It's comfortable, perhaps too comfortable, especially in London, because you're surrounded with a Bahraini community as well. But I really enjoyed my time there.
I got an apartment in London. That's how much I enjoyed London.
Whereabouts in London?
Angel.
Hello. Yeah. My university was by there.
Oh, Cass University, no?
Exactly.
Yeah, they changed that name, didn't they?
Named Bays. Now named Bays. I got the new certificate that has Bays on it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, how do you feel about that?
I was there a couple of weeks ago. Actually, it was interesting to see the universities changed. Yeah,
But, I mean, that's purely woke nonsense from my perspective.
it's. I mean, I wasn't involved in like the conversation that happened. I think it was far. I mean, it's a far deeper conversation. I think around CAS because it's. I thought it was a good thing that they had a conversation around it. And it was important for their current constituents. And if it's important for their current constituents, then I think it was a good thing for them to do. I don't think they could have progressed as a business school.
Really? You think so that badly?
Doing it. Like the kind of pressure that they were under, but also kind of the self-acknowledgement around what is it that the university stands for? Does it stand for, in the modern age, something that's connected to the transatlantic slave trade? Or is it saying that actually that's not how business should be done? It should not be done on extraction, should not be done on neocolonial lines. And that kind of message to the current students was very important. That was something that was pushed by the CAS community, the professors, the lecturers, the students that were there, masters and undergrad. And yeah, it's something I don't think they could have avoided. I was surprised that they avoided it for as long as they did, because it was a conversation that was kind of bubbling up. But yeah, now when you go to CAS, there's far more diversity, very visibly. I think in the space, far more welcoming environment for different kinds of ideas that I thought, okay, like the Marxist Party was very prominent, and like their poster is like, this is really interesting for a business school. To the racial equity kind of clubs and work. And that kind of thing is important for human beings to feel.
That's where me and you are definitely going to butt heads on this, because I've always believed in a merit-based society rather than...
Oh, no, I as well. But if it's skewed in the other way, very intentionally, it's not merit-based.
Well, I don't know how to answer that question. I mean, Princeton, Harvard...
But merit-based in what sense?
No, but this is what I'm saying, right? Princeton and Harvard have had years and years, maybe 2 decades worth of
like
issues.
the diversity quota and like things like that.
Exactly. I mean, they're...
That's one thing.
Yeah.
And then another thing is, do you have the name of a professor at your business school representing the slave trade? Is a very different kind of conversation.
Hey, history is history.
No, it is history, but it's important to acknowledge. It's important to acknowledge and not kind of put it under the rug. And then you can acknowledge it, and then you have a decision to make as a community. But what do we represent kind of going forwards?
Here's the thing where I think we both kind of clash on this, because I was really shocked when I went to Russia, and the amount of sickle and hammer I saw on buildings, and I was like, what? And I remember going to, I forgot the name of the museum in Moscow, but I went to the museum in Moscow, and the front, like the moment you basically walk in, you see Stalin in this like beautiful like wedding like picture.
Yeah.
And you're like, whoa. And it kind of just like hits you really hard. And then yes, he also did terrible things, but people also liked him at the same time. And that's my problem with CAS, right? When you boil down the man as just being a slave trader, you're kind of losing the greater perspective of it, right?
I mean, it's the same, like even St. Christopher's, had a conversation, I remember, it was, I think, the late 90s, early 2000s. I don't know if you know what happened with St. Christopher's. They had their old logo.
Okay.
And their old logo was, it used to be a cross, a particular cross called the St. Christopher's Cross, St. Christopher's School. And it took a while for some of the Bahraini board members to then realize, actually, this was the same cross that was used in the Crusades against Muslims.
Okay.
And you can call it like that was pre-woke times, but that was a conversation that happened as well. Like, okay, that's actually what St. Christopher's was built on its foundation of, as like St. Christopher's Cross, honoring that kind of patron saint, but it came with all this other kind of baggage. Yes, in part, there was reasons why they chose in good faith for the name St. Christopher's, the symbolism, the emblem, etc. But at the same time, you have a difficulty in a Muslim country and with Bahrainis and Muslim students under an umbrella that is representing the Crusades and their very oppression and destruction.
Yeah.
And, but then you have a choice. Do you continue with that, Or is it like, all right, fine, till here, and then let's switch our representation to be something that's more in tune with the times, to be something that's actually more relevant, something that students feel comfortable with, that you feel is actually going to create a better learning environment, and a learning environment that really breeds more diversity of thought.
I bet you, if I go with you right now to St. Christopher and we take 10 students and we ask them when the crusade happens and who are the Templars, I don't think a lot of them will be like, oh, around the 14th century. When did the first crusades happen? I think it was around the 14th century.
But I think part of it was interesting at the time, and I was very young when these conversations happened. And I think part of the point was they didn't teach about it. They did teach about the Crusades. It came up in our history class. But the symbolism of what that actually meant was not highlighted. And I felt as a Bahraini,
I mean, buddy, it's like 2,000 years ago, right? I mean, the first crusade.
But I'm saying it's the cross, because the cross is still used today.
Sure.
As a symbolism.
And Templars still exist today as well.
That particular thing, but is it an appropriate thing to have as a symbol of a school in Bahrain? Would you like?
Sure, why not?
But why?
But I believe that you make meaning of the symbol, right? Like the Nazi symbol, for example, was used in Buddhism.
No one was making meaning out of the symbol. There was pretty much only one. There was pretty much only one meaning. But
what,
for
the
me,
Crusades and Templars? They're still hanging around.
But it wasn't with but it was around the Crusades and the specific kinds of Crusades that had happened against Muslim communities. And for me, it was very interesting to see with CAS, like coming back to that.
Sure.
Both of my initial educational experiences were both rebranded for very similar kind of reasons. And I don't have a problem with that. For me, I support it because it does create a better learning environment. I actually felt when I was there in St. Chris, a far better and more comfortable learning environment, just having had that kind of acknowledgement, having had that space and conversation. As a student, you're like, I've never thought about that before. I've never really considered this. I've never really considered the meaning and the history. It makes you a better critical thinker as well. And I don't think it's something St. Christopher's regrets at all for doing the decision. It's something in which I think is only right in this kind of society that we're in. It's more representative. And it gets away from neo-colonial thinking in different forms. And to have that as a kid, as a conversation to have happened, was great to have. And I wasn't there, obviously, when they made the decision of CAS and Bays. And I can imagine it would be the same for students there. But actually to have that kind of debate is a great thing, that they decided not just off a whim, but after very deep consultation with every one of their stakeholders, trustees, funders, board members, students across the board, alumni, that's the decision that they kind of made democratically together. I think is an important thing to acknowledge.
Do you not feel like you're
Are we starting, by the way, or are we?
It doesn't matter, does it? You get the edit and you tell me anything you want removed.
Right.
But don't you feel that in that kind of sensibility, in that you're losing heritage and you're losing history, right? You can't define St. Christopher as a Templar or from that perspective school, or you can say, hey, you know what, it did happen, and this is the historical effects of it.
Well, I think it's important to make a distinction, because whether it was St. Christopher's or CAS, these are emblems and symbols. They weren't built and they weren't operating on those values. Like, there's a very big kind of difference between that. CAS, in its teachings, wasn't teaching you how to perpetuate neo-slavery and neo-colonialism. Like, that wasn't...
I would definitely have signed up for that course. That was available. Hey, I'm going to go to Mars, right? So
the thing is, I would hope you're joking, but I know you're kind of not. Like, I know if that module was there, 100%. Like at this point, like I've known you for like half an hour. I think you'd sign up to that class just to see and just to be curious.
I would be the top student. I would only show up for that class.
But and there's a very big distinction between that, like on the representation, on the branding, on the communication, versus what the actual courses are, what your actual experiences in the school, what it kind of represents. For me, those are two very different things. But at the same time, I studied in CAS at a time when it was the financial crisis. When my degree was investment and financial risk management. And it was very interesting for me to see that in the process of studying risk models, I would come to class where the teachers would tell us, all right, this model was based on a particular understanding of the financial system, which, we've had this event happen in markets, which we predicted should only happen once every 100 years. It's happened every single day now for the last 2 weeks. It doesn't work. And you then start to get into a conversation around the system of capitalism, on the way that it's built, on the type of extractivism that was kind of happening around society, how the bankers' bailout that was kind of being promoted at the time from Obama and co. And you start to get into, okay, but actually where do these forms of modern day extraction show up? Where do these forms of modern day neocolonialism show up? Where do these forms of where the system is really not working in the way that was intended, supposedly for the benefit of all? And it's a very, very, very small microcosm of a deeper kind of legacy of a system that was then built on the foundations of racism, of patriarchy, and it's an important thing then for a business school to have acknowledged. I think it's also important not to completely put it under the rug and pretend it never existed, and actually the roots of the university, because I think there's a big learning around that. I find with St. Christopher's, I would find it more enjoyable, and I don't think this is what they do today, actually to acknowledge the history of the emblem, the history of the logo, the history of actually that conversation, because it's a learning moment. It's a way of actually being able to get a sense of, this was what history was. This were the foundations, but actually this is where we've made a choice collectively to head into a kind of a different direction.
I find that very interesting because this is very counter to if you know Thomas Sowell.
No, I don't. Not familiar.
He's a student of Milton Friedman, former communist, I would say. Now very, very, I would say, right leaning. He's Black himself, and he talks about slavery and stuff like that, and he talks about reparation.
Yep, reparations.
And he said this. He said it was so. What was fascinating to me is he said, the families of those who were slaves are almost they're done. They're gone.
Yeah.
Their grandparents weren't slaves. Maybe their great grandparents at this point. So who do you own reputation to? Right? And at what point do you say, that's the history? Hey, you know what? That's the cards you got dealt. It sucks. It is what it is. But you live today and you're not your great grandparents or whatever timeline. Yep. And so that's the kind of dialogue that I would carry when it comes to, I don't know, the Templars, Nazi symbolism, I don't know, CAS. Princeton University, one of the professors talked about this issue when they were changing the whole names, because some of them were slave owners.
Yep.
And the professor said, I'll find you the speech he gave. He said, why don't we just change the name of Princeton then? And the students were like, oh no, that's going too far. Because people still want to have the name Princeton on their title, right? It's great to be woke, and it's great to show to the world, hey, you know what? We care about our history and our past and blah, 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 until it affects the bottom line.
Until it affects the bottom line. Internalized capitalism hits in.
Yeah, right. I mean, in the end, no one wants to be graduated from a university called Timbuktu.
Yeah.
Which is a place.
Unless it's the fine graduates of Timbuktu University.
Exactly.
Which I'm sure is a reputable university.
Exactly.
But see, I mean, I found it, in the specific case of CAS, it was overwhelmingly students voted for, yes, it should change.
I'm not surprised.
I was pleasantly surprised, because it's not necessarily a university that's known for its radical politics in any way, shape, or form, but it does speak to the type of, I think the type of shift as well in the business world. It does speak to the type of mindset as well that's shifting on what is important to acknowledge, and what's the kind of vision that we'd like to have for the future.
Sure.
And what should business also serve and stand for?
Well, this is another thing that, in my heart of hearts, I believe, profit maximization. That's the goal for a business, right? And your responsibility is to your shareholders, not to your stakeholders, right? That's the way I've always looked at the business world.
Okay.
I don't believe in ESG scores and
Okay.
stuff like that. I think that a lot of that is dangerous dialogue, and that the S&P 500 now have taken on ESG scores to put into their index fund is very scary to me.
Yeah. Do you want to speak more about that?
Sure,
Why
if
do
you
you
want.
feel? Why do you feel kind of a stakeholder approach is not why or what business should be doing versus a shareholder approach?
I believe at the core business is that a business should reflect its own value rather than being part of or trying to change the value of society. In the sense, like Nike should focus on making shoes.
Okay.
It should not have a policy engagement of what's happening with football players taking the knee.
Okay.
That's not the responsibility of companies.
Okay.
Right? And I think once you cross that line, once corporations start having their hands into what's politically motivated, you end up in a very dangerous world.
Interesting.
You know, where even like right now, the way how content is fed at a population is through marketeers. Because markets and practices set the standards of what kind of content is approvable for them to market to, like YouTube, for example, right? And so if your content isn't very approval friendly from the marketing agencies, YouTube doesn't want to host your content.
Okay.
Do you get kind of what I mean? So you end up in that very dangerous world where you have the systems set up in order to encourage what's the best items to sell to you, right? And that's why I think you find this dialogue in the US. Less than 5% are gay in the US. Less than 0.5% are transsexual. Yet we talk about these issues like 50% of the population is trans or gay.
Yeah. But do you think that's because of
Marketing.
shareholder capitalism or stakeholder capitalism?
I think it's purely stakeholder capitalism. I think we've put so much effort and refinement into what the stakeholders want rather than, hey, you know what? We're worried about profits at the end of the day, and we should focus on that and stop trying to manipulate the public. That's the scary thing to me.
So what does responsible business look like for you under a shareholder approach?
That you're operating within the law.
Okay.
Right? That's I think it's as clear cut as that. And the moment you try to circumvent the law or you try to do any kind of coercion or collusion, collusion is above board, coercion is underhanded. I think anything that's coverted, like you should get really hit hard.
Okay. And when that law also pertains to social issues or environmental issues, where does that kind of fit in that framework?
Well, that's really interesting. I see it as this, right? I'm very much a believer in Milton Friedman's version of capitalism, not cronyism, what we're kind of experiencing at the moment. I think corporations have been able to influence public policy to an unprecedented degree, especially if you're looking in the US. And I mean, there's whole businesses now set up in being able to manipulate presidents, bureaucrats, ministers, governors, mayors. That exists as a business is terrifying to me.
Yeah.
Like that lobbying is
legal.
Legal.
Yeah.
That's crazy to me. So that's where I see where issues in line. And Milton Friedman always would say, you market freedom until the effect that your inherent business practices is damaging things you don't own. For example, if you're a company that's producing, let's call it a soft drink like Coca-Cola.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Thank you. So we have best audio possible. Thank you. So if you're like Coca-Cola, I believe if you own the land of, let's say, a riverbed or river, you can pollute that river as long as it's your section of land.
Okay.
The moment that river flows down into property that you don't own,
which is how rivers work,
right? You should be slapped as hard as possible.
Okay.
I think that is as fair as it gets.
Okay.
Where do you see it on that end?
Definitely not a shareholder capitalist, I have to say.
You don't say.
Far from the shareholder and far from the capitalism on both fronts. I mean, I think Friedman has been proved wrong already.
What?
I mean, I think the stakeholder approach, at the very minimum, we do require a stakeholder approach, because I think a stakeholder approach is far more scientific. It is a better measure as well of how a business is actually able to function and runs. A business is not a single entity. It's not a microcosm, just separate and isolated from everything else. As you said, even if it comes to the river is connected to everything in the seas and the oceans. It's connected to the fish. It's connected to the communities that are kind of sustained around it. And no business operates in silo. A business operates within the context of its community. A business operates in the context of its ecosystem services. A business operates in the context of its laws and regulations. And yes, there's a river you need to consider, and there's rivers of people and laws and services, environmentally and otherwise, that need to be considered, that actually enable a business to operate in the first place. And it also goes then to what's the point of a business. For me, it's not just profit maximization. Purpose of the business at its core should be the betterment of, you'd hope, society at its best, or at its worst, doesn't harm society. And you do need to then consider what are the social components, because you have people working there at a business. You have people who are across the supply chain, from whether it's transportation or whether it's something that's intense for minerals that are involved in that process. You have species that are, of course, affected depending on the business that you're in. And you have a far larger view of what the economy actually is, which isn't this kind of separate, isolated business. You still need to use the roads if you're going to be transporting something that's paid by government or public services or tax or otherwise. You still need to be using logistics and public infrastructure. So it's not something that's actually feasible to say that a business kind of exists in its silo. And then it's also, what does a business serve for in that wider ecosystem? It's where the concept of, I think, stakeholder capitalism really has been gaining more momentum of, how do we serve our wider stakeholders? And that's not just a single shareholder. And actually a business is far more innovative, far more inclusive, and far serves its own purpose as a result. And it also goes into a little bit of what you said around where are also the limits as well to it. Where should there be certain limits to growth, to extraction, to expansion? And where is it that a business should not be growing beyond the means of how it can actually control its impacts as well?
It's interesting that you bring that up. I think we have different viewpoints on certain key items here. I believe the least amount of regulations on both the hiring and firing process, on running the business, the more organically the business can institute. The closer you can get the business world to nature, and the survival of the fittest, or the survival of the one that's able to adapt the best, the better it is for the business, the more resistant that business is in the market, right? I think when you start introducing ESG quotas and stuff like that, you're creating a lot of bloat in a corporation. I think you are then tied in a weird way where you have like Ford. That's been they had bankruptcy. They claimed bankruptcy 4 times or 3 times. GM, I think also they had to get a government bailout 3 times, right? I think those, hey, you fucked up. You need to die. Sorry. Time to make space for the new, right? And I think that's what it comes down to. Bad ideas need to perish and good ideas need to survive. And the market needs to decide. I think the more there's regulation from the government end and saying, hey, you know what, we need to do the X, Y, or Z, the more counter it is. Thomas Wall makes a really interesting statement, and he talks about minimum income or minimum wage. And he said how that destroyed millions of people that were able to earn a few bucks here and there by doing odd jobs. That suddenly the business wouldn't be able to hire because you have to have now a minimum salary, I think, of $13. Right? And then which is the most diabolical and smartest thing Amazon has ever done, was increasing minimum wage from 13 to 16 right? Pushing it on that dialogue, presenting themselves as being this, angelic business, humanitarian business. We care.
Yeah.
And then trying to lobby to increase the minimum wage because they know all these smaller shops, all these mom and pop stores, all these smaller enterprises, these SMEs are not able to afford it.
Yeah.
They're already struggling on their balance sheet.
Yeah.
And so they just got rid of a ton of competitors.
Yeah.
And that's creating barriers of entry right there. It's genius.
And they're the archetypical shareholder approach to capitalism.
Yeah, but that's my problem is that's not capitalism, that's cronyism. Because they're
Which is-
only able to do that because they have influences on the local politicians.
Which is what the system leads to inevitably. And
I
it
don't
is that
think
kind of
so.
it is that kind of race to the bottom. And one thing I will agree with you in, but a different slant to it.
Sure.
You mentioned something really interesting, which was business should be as close to nature and kind of nature's principles. So I did essentially a master's in a field called biomimicry.
Yes, you did. I remember.
And biomimicry is the science of studying nature's models, rules, systems, processes, and looking to emulate that in the form of products, services, organizations. So essentially, what does it actually mean for business to be close to nature? And actually, I find a very different story because the story of Darwin and his theory wasn't about survival of the fittest. Often it's misunderstood. Actually, what we find in the natural world is that the species and ecosystems that time and time thrive and survive are the ones that are far more cooperative. Competition is good in very small forms. It helps different species, of course, in surviving on very kind of short timescales, but actually across the long span of history and geological and biological time, we know and seen time and time again, it's the most collaborative, it's the most integrated, the ones that have a stakeholder approach to their ecosystems and actually create conditions that are conducive for that kind of cooperation are the ecosystems that thrive and survive the best. They're the most innovative. They're the ones that have been able to figure out how to adapt to many different climatic changes, to species invasions. And I think that at its core is also what we should be getting business towards.
I don't remember reading that in Origins of Species by Darwin.
But that's what the theory is.
Origin of Species?
No. I'm saying, but Darwin
Sure.
is far beyond the origin of species.
Okay.
Darwin's work expands far. He wrote about competition and survival, yes,
Yes.
but actually he wrote far more about collaboration. He wrote far more about commensalism and mutualism.
I've only read Origin of Species from his work. I haven't
And I think
looked at
that's-
his extended
And
work.
I think that's one of the interesting things about his work, which is often kind of misunderstood, because actually we see in real time and practice, yes, the species and ecosystems that are more collaborative are more biodiverse, that they're healthier ecosystems. And it's also ones in which when humans participate in natural ecosystems as well, actually those ecosystems are better for it when we're doing it in the right way.
Do you not feel that we have this humanization almost of nature approach? We have this weird kind of like mental image in that nature is somehow kind and goddess-like. You know, out of 40,000 mushrooms, only 300 or so are edible. Out of from 100% of vegetation, only about 1.5% of vegetation is humanly edible. There is no such thing as an animal that dies from old age. Generally, they die from sickness or they're hunted. Right? I see now more than ever people trying to hug bears, which is to me
Not a smart thing to do.
so moronic. It is so crazy.
That's the part of Darwin's theories and actions.
There you go. Absolutely. It's called the Darwin Award, right? So I feel like that's...
No, I mean, it's a really great point that you make in terms of how we view nature. Because first of all, it's strange to talk about nature as a thing when, of course,
We're part of it.
We are part of it.
I agree with
you.
you
We are
totally.
nature. We're connected. And sometimes the human language tends to separate as well. The shareholder approach to capitalism has been built around the separation of nature. It has been built around trying to separate nature from us. And it's then easier to exploit the rest of nature.
Interesting, okay.
Because we're not a part of it. Nature doesn't have feelings, emotions. Nature is this kind of robotic thing. And some of the roots of capitalism were built on that kind of construct. And when you have that kind of separation, when you do think of not as even stakeholders, not just as human stakeholders, but also as the more than human world, it's far easier to then exploit and oppress and extract. Now, to the point of then, yes, we can consider nature more as us and we are nature, but I absolutely agree with you. We should also not romanticize what the natural world is. We shouldn't put our human kind of ideas and emotions on other species, on other ecosystems. So when we see that nature does work collaboratively, yes, we can see that, and it does that in its own particular way, and it does
symbiotically. Yes,
it does that symbiotically, it does that mutualistically, it does that commensally. There's many different forms and relationships of cooperation within the natural world. As a whole, it's a fine balance, but we can start to look at sort of the micro nuances of the relationships. And we are better off, I think, as a society, also as business, when we actually start to study the mangrove forest that's kind of next door here. Actually understand, what is the mangrove forest really doing? What are its principles? What are its systems? How is it actually able to have survived in this kind of environment for so long? What is it doing? And what does it actually mean for us as communities and businesses to be operating in a way where we are not the top of the food chain, so to speak, imposing what human society should be and is on the natural world, but what does it actually mean to shift our perspective to say, how do we actually participate in this ecosystem that we're part of? How can we actually contribute to it? And the stakeholder approach, a more inclusive approach, is one small entry point to it. Now that's very separate to ESG, which is a whole different topic, I think, in and of itself, as well, and where the question of how is it that business should be functioning in a way that it actually gets to those standards. And at the moment, it is a minefield. At the moment, there isn't a lot of absolute best case practices when it comes to regulation, I think, around that, but we're definitely on the journey towards it.
I hear where you're coming from, and I agree with a lot of the points that you're saying, especially when you talk about I can't say the word.
Corporations?
Cooperation. Thank you. There needs to be that for merchants to do their job when it comes to a larger state level. In the end of the day, if we look at, if we compare apples and pears, there's a reason why China's growth is double digits, right? And it's because although their government is communistic, the market is capitalistic. Yeah. And that's the reason why we're seeing a slowdown in the US. And when we're talking about negative externalities, which is, companies that pollute or produce nasty byproducts and stuff like that, there are negative externalities that aren't being taken account of.
Exactly.
Right? And that we can agree with.
Yeah.
Because, if you're a factory that's dumping sodium and nitrogen and I forgot what's the acid one chemical up into the air, and it's creating acidic rain in Australia. You're not being taxed for it.
Yep.
Right? And so there is that dichotomy of it, right? So these negative externalities are hidden usually on the public side, and I wouldn't know how to fix it. I wouldn't know how you would charge a company that kind of a damage.
Yep.
I think there needs to be in the fundamental belief on my end is that any government intervention it will create a market failure. In the UK, public photography or videography is perfectly fine, and you can film and do and take pictures of anything you like. And there's this weird asterisk when it comes to the law, where if you, for example, I don't know, let's say I find out where you live, right? Let's say I'm a stalker.
Yeah.
I can take pictures from you entering, exit your house until it's excessive. Isn't that fascinating? And what the rule of excessive is open to interpretation. So I could be outside, like on a street corner with a camera for 3 days.
Okay.
And that could still be okay, but maybe on the fourth day.
Fourth day is a bit excessive.
It's excessive.
Interesting.
Interesting how that law works, right? However, if I'm using it for monetary gain, so for example, if I'm a detective and I'm taking pictures of you for whatever reason, right? Then I have to get, I would either have to get permission from you or I would have to blur out your face before I can give it to my client. Because it's become now a
commercialized
product. Isn't that interesting how that
Oh, wow. But you're also talking about what are kind of where is it that there's good regulation that is protecting society? Where do you actually need more of that? And where we should be letting go of structures and bureaucracies that are not actually serving for
do you not feel like the best approach is just small governments?
Small governments?
Yeah, as in like let market decide, only intervene when it's near catastrophe, and that's it.
It's a fine theory. However,
you don't like it, huh?
we're at such a stage in our epoch of human civilization, where I don't think we're there yet. I think what is true, we need more functional local governments, so more functional municipalities, more functional towns, more functional cities, and I think definitely in that form. I also think we're at a stage where ecologically, politically, and economically, we require such a huge shift in transition that, and I'd say particularly in the global north, it is hard to see it happening on purely just only a small government scale. I'd say it's yes and.
Do you not feel, in your heart of hearts, if Bahrain would take away a lot of the overheads, a lot of the bureaucracy, and then just be like, I don't know, Singapore of the 70s, right? Where it was this hub of just trading, merchants, selling and buying. Do you not feel like Bahrain's entire living standard for the population would skyrocket upwards like it did?
I think it depends how it's done. The rules that you just kind of mentioned around like one specific industry, I can tell you many that, different industry folks would say, okay, there's actually no reason for it. It's too prohibitive and actually it's not in line with the times. And I think all of that, yes, would be a much easier environment. But there's another...
Sorry to interrupt you. I've never heard of a corporation ever in the history who've ever said, hey, you know what? We need regulation. Unless it's to the benefit for them.
but also as a company, we also know there's some regulation that is essential and important that does need to be put in place. Because you also can't have, a race to the bottom indeed when it comes to pollution. When it comes to, polluting the river, as
negative externalities.
The same thing, and all those negative externalities, they do need to be costed. They do need to be in some way, shape, or form taxed as well. Those are the kinds of regulations that I would certainly welcome more of, that creates actually an ecosystem and a framework for me, a better kind of innovation. An innovation that's saying, okay, that's actually more sustainable, that it's being done of innovation within ecological limits, innovation that's actually serving the well-being of our society and of our communities, innovation that is actually able to be sustainable across decades and generations, and not something that is going to be maybe profitable for 5, 6, 7 years, but is no way, shape, or form going to be sustainable environmentally, economically, ecologically, societally speaking. I think there are certain kinds of regulations which are helpful and useful. And at the same time, when we start to look at investment as well, and how that's done, and who can invest and where they can invest in a way that protects, the country's sovereignty and its long-term economic stability, especially.
Let me interrupt you on there, because let's go. This is a thought experiment. How would you tell the company who owns the river for, let's say, that section? I do agree with you that their ability to pollute that land should only reach that land ownership. Right? And as soon as that passes through that whatever imaginary line where they stop owning it, they should be somehow fined or punished or whatever else. How do you motivate companies to be more in line with the environment from what you're saying? Do you punish or do you reward?
There's a lot of different theories, and it really depends on the particular type of ecology, community, kind of economy that you're in. One theory goes, no company should own the river in the first place. You shouldn't own that kind of natural asset, so to speak. It's something that should always remain public and in the commons. And actually, when it's in the commons, it's far easier to manage, to regulate kind of around, because as a company, you're not owning it, you are using its services and ecological services. And you and others have a duty to basically take care of the public commons when you're using it. In other cases, when it is privatized, which is, I think, far more damaging often, then sometimes it's in the form of taxation. And in other cases, when it's far more of an extreme pollution that has happened, you have communities demanding for reparations, as you said kind of earlier, as a way to do that. And there's different countries also trying to do things on scale around nature's rights and actually enshrining nature's rights into their constitutions. You have, I'll use the case of a river, where in New Zealand, there's rights that are actually given to a river. What that meant in kind of practice was the community that was living across the river was given reparations for the damage that was done to their community. They were given democratic say as well on when a company wanted to use it, on the how and the what and the why and the products and services.
That just opens the door to bribery.
Sorry?
That just opens the door to bribery.
But it's all kind of regulated in a way where you have indigenous communities in that case who care about the ecosystem and the land. There is agreed in ecological principles of what is considered healthy. It also goes to the point around, we had this conversation off camera around sort of food and food sustainability as well, on, how do you then protect the fish stocks? How do you ensure that those are still healthy? And there's different frameworks around that, depending on the location, the locale, for how that's done. I think in the context of Bahrain, I think what's more interesting is it's when there's a danger if we start to privatize everything in a form that's based on debt-based finance. I think that's where regulation is important to protect the country. Bahrain is a small island developing state. We all know we have a lot of debt as a country, but that's something that's a very common story for many small island developing states that are kind of in this cycle of exacerbated climate impacts, deteriorating biodiversity, and increased debt. And we have a situation where small and developing states between 2016 and 2022, we had collectively $1.5 billion given in climate finance, collectively to small islands. So that's 1.5 billion going to supporting adaptation across sea level rise, supporting ecosystems, supporting adaptation and building of infrastructure, so better public transportation, green buildings, supporting kind of heat stress methods, helping as well with agriculture and food sustainability and otherwise. And then you had those same small islands pay out, I think it was over 22 billion in the same period to external creditors.
I love it.
And you have such an imbalance and injustice. And then what kind of happens with private capital when it goes into those small islands where there isn't regulation is it's almost that kind of race to the bottom. You have, okay, we actually need to adapt then to climate change. We actually need to upgrade our urban infrastructure. We need to really be more resilient in our agriculture and really find, aquaponics, hydroponics, different ways of growing our food sustainably. We need to be building a public transport, but then all of that is required as well because of the changing environment that we're in, because of more extreme heat stress that is not a small island's fault.
Okay.
And that private capital then comes in the form of we need to take out either more debt in the forms of bonds and others, or private capital comes in and basically takes advantage of that kind of situation. And it's a very kind of tricky road because then the river is privatized along with every single natural asset that you have. And in that situation, it is very difficult to plan for a country's sustainability in the long run. If you can pollute without regulation, and not only just pollute without regulation, if you can start to extract and own without consideration for maybe the longer term planning of that country. And that's more important in smaller islands and smaller countries. You know, you have in the US a little bit sort of grander space where in some cases it's not sort of so felt, but yeah, definitely in the context of Bahrain and small islands, it's something that is that kind of regulation for the protection of our country, our sovereignty, for the long-term planning and ability of Bahrain to actually think in the future and to plan across the future, across visions is essential. And yeah, those kinds of regulations are very, very welcome.
I agree with a lot with you saying. I think there needs to be what's the right word? I think there needs to be a ground up restructuring on a lot of things.
Yeah.
And there needs to be a lot of time that needs to be taken and step back and being like, hey, you know what? These things are working, these things aren't.
Yeah.
And really, really focus on it. And I think there's some key issues here that need to be readjusted for and how the future is heading. For Bahrain to be like, hey, you know what? 200,000 Saudis are going to come every weekend and spend on the economy isn't something that you can build on forever and hope that it continues forever. Because once COVID hits again, or something similar to that degree, where Saudi is not able to travel for 3 years, you have people really suffering. All those coffee shops, all those shisha shops, all the dry cleaning businesses where you don't think of, right? That are externality owned by the hotels. They were in real pain.
Yeah.
But let's take a break. Do you want a coffee?
I'm going to stop my. But why do you think people may not be so happy with it? Like, what are like just kind of think around why?
I think it's just people, you know, who want to take the shortcut. That's what I think it is.
Okay.
I think there is this weird thing, and I don't know if we're both on the same page on this, that gratitude has become such a key focus in people's lives that they don't understand it's greed that brought you to where you are. Your parents were greedy for a better life. They were greedy to have you have a better life, right? It's that aspect of greed, that wanting to be better, that having a better quality of life, having a nicer car, living a better lifestyle, eating better food. That's what allowed us that innovation. And the moment you're kind of like take that foot off the pedal and you're like, oh, you know what? I'm happy living in a 1-bedroom flat. That's when it gets dangerous.
Why does it get dangerous?
Because if you're looking at someone who's worse off than you and saying, well, at least I'm not that. You're not defining yourself by the very best. You're defining yourself than the worst. Because how far down that hierarchy do you have to go and be like, oh, at least I'm not a drug addict. At least I'm not a thief. Okay. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. It's very quick to fall down that staircase.
Oh, so much to unpack there.
You don't think so?
So much to unpack there. Oh God, I don't even know where to start. But let me start here.
All right, let's go for it.
Well, I mean, one, obviously in the system, depending on how you define the system. So even like the global system that we're in, we are in a system that we cannot sustain. This kind of system, whilst it may have gotten us to a certain point, can't take us to probably where we would hope to go, which is a flourishing society, which is a prosperous society, which is a society that's designed around human well-being and more than human well-being, in which communities are able to achieve a high level of life satisfaction, of prosperity in different forms. Our current system
of greed.
Well, I'll get there, because in a greed-based system, we're not able to have that for a large amount of people.
You don't think so?
I think we have biophysical limits to what that is. I think there are certain limits to growth in this current system. This current system that we have now, one is very unequal. So, I come from the climate change world and I can kind of look at, okay, actually, yes, there is kind of a greed that's there that has been built off those societies, of course, of extractivism. And we have a society where 92% of all global emissions are from the global north. So that's US, Europe, and kind of Australia, kind of in that. And then 8% is global south.
Okay.
is responsible for 8% of emissions beyond what we'd call kind of planetary boundaries, beyond what actually is your fair share. So that's 8% of emissions from MENA, from Africa, from Latin America, Asia combined.
Sure.
It's a huge, huge, huge disparity. Now, if we all tried to do the American life, of course, we're not going to be able to survive on this planet. We just don't have enough rocks, materials, minerals, the technologies, the space kind of for that. And it's also a question of what part of that life doesn't actually serve for human well-being. I know food systems is very important for you. And actually, when we start to look at the unsustainability of global agriculture and how that's done, it's not a case of we want to expand that as a whole. We need to completely redesign that system in itself. We live in a system where our climate, our atmosphere, our biodiversity is just not able to sustain it. And we're not able to sustain the amount of exploitation as well that's kind of built around that, of harnessing those systems. It's a system that won't take us into the 22nd century. It's not a system that's fit for the 21st either. And a fundamental restructuring needs to be had. Now, the question of greed or gratitude is an interesting one. There is a incredible human being, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, God rest his soul, who is kind of giving the argument around, are we made for goodness or are we made for greed? Actually, like, where is that balance? Are we inherently selfish? Do we believe in kind of the Dawkins theory of the selfish gene? Or do we kind of go towards actually human beings have this capability for goodness, for conviviality, for community building? I won't go into the science of it, but you can have your perspective, of course, of which part of human society we should be building around. Should we be building around greed or goodness? Should we be building around competition or collaboration? I would contend that we'd be far better building off of conviviality and community than focusing on the greed aspect. But it's also a really important point that you make around where are we content, actually? Where is it that we feel we're living a good enough life? And is it enough to live good enough, or do we have to live kind of exceptionally all the time? I think it's an ethical question. It's a philosophical question. I think that question really ties around also happiness as well, and where are humans most happy or not happy. There's a lot of studies done on, at a certain point of material satisfaction, humans don't become happier once they have more and more and more.
Sure.
And where is that kind of fine balance between where we're able to provide safe living conditions for everyone, where, alhamdulillah, we do have the blessing in Bahrain of we're not going hungry. We do have our water, electricity, and what does it actually mean in a system that's able to be distributed equally to everyone on the planet in a way that doesn't damage the planet? And I don't think a greed-based system enables us to get to that point.
Here's first of all, you're one of my favorite guests. Let me put that out there right now.
Oh, thank you very much.
Because it's very rare that I can have an actual interesting discussion with someone about topics that range from such a large scope. Honestly, it's a pleasure.
I have to say it's rare for me to discuss these topics with a shareholder capitalism. It's refreshing. It's a reminder again of like,
what's your mission?
La. Sometimes I'm in my bubbles, my friend. I'm either in like the stakeholder capitalism groups or the climate people or the post-growth people. So it's nice again to engage in this kind of conversation.
To see if Milton Friedman kind of ad.
It's been quite a few years since I've seen someone brave enough to say I'm a Milton Friedman guy. Yeah, I respect it.
It's a shame. It's a shame. It's a shame.
I don't agree with it, but it's nice to
see it. I appreciate it. Listen, you're really one of my favorite guests we've ever had on, and that just from the level of discussions that we're able to have. I think for a lot of the approaches, we just have different approach of the solution.
Yeah.
I believe in a competition above all. You know, Theodore Roosevelt always preached competition. And I think that's the best way of systems to work. And I agree with you that we live in a society of unlimited wants and finite resources. So the question is, how do we then move to a mechanism or modality where you can use past existing goods or innovate on existing or new technologies in order to satisfy, and whether that be moving from silicon-based technology to biological-based technologies as a solution to it, whether it's a population issue, which it is, because you can only have an increase of your GDP as population increases. Right? The moment you have a decline of a population in a country, it's very, very difficult to keep your GDP increasing, because the level of productivity that you can contribute to a global scale is finite, right? And more importantly than all of that, retirement funds work on the current labor. You're working for the retirement fund is being spent on people who are currently retired.
Yeah.
So you need to have the next generation to be either wealthier or larger than your generation in order to fund your retirement.
Yeah.
That's how it is, right? And I think that's a lot of key aspects that we don't really talk about. Thomas Sowell, again, he brought this up. He said, look, if you look at the poorest of the poor in America, 9 out of 10 over the last 10 years have increased their living standard. The system is working. People often talk about Reagan's trickle-down economy and stuff like that, and it has its faults. It really does, but
quite a few faults.
It's still moving. It's still managing. Capitalism is still working. The poorest of the poor are still moving up.
It's hard to make an argument that capitalism is working when the very survival of our species and human civilization is at risk because of that very system, I think, on one hand. And you say, one point you mentioned, I just want to kind of pull on that thread, because you're saying kind of in this current system, that's how it works, and it's true, that's how it works. But it's also, should it work that way, and should we look to completely reimagine that system? Sure. So on GDP, for me, I think there's a far more fundamental question of, should we be moving from that metric in the first place? Is that metric around GDP, organizing societies around economic growth, is the de facto goal helpful for us or not? And I would kind of contend with, actually, we should be moving away from a GDP-based system. Because even if we think of the concept of GDP, which was a temporary wartime measure, which the very creators of GDP said it should not be actually used for the purpose of designing society beyond war, that actually it's not something that is to be serving human community well-being, that businesses shouldn't be designed around. Creators of GDP were very clear around where it should be used and where it shouldn't. And the way that we're using it now, and we kind of think around, okay, 2% GDP growth per year globally, and we kind of, exponentials, we kind of exponentially cross that over 100 years. You're getting to a point of an economy where there's not enough resources, not enough materials, not enough minerals, not enough mines, not enough labor that's ever able to really hold that. And even if you look at one specific industry, you're talking about real estate. Real estate where it's not designed around people actually being able to live in communities affordably, but real estate where it's just simply as an investment, year on year, as a mode of capital accumulation. Eventually, you're going to get generations not able to afford real estate. It's not a model that you can kind of extrapolate that across many generations is going to be suitable for and going to be fit for purpose. I think a lot of the ideas that maybe could have had a place in the 19th and 20th century, but I do have a belief we need to have 21st century economics. We can't build our society based on a society that now is living in a far more systemic world, a far more interconnected world, a world with the type of technologies that we have, the type of the world where we have different polycrises, where it's not just one crisis in some place in the world that's isolated, but it's multiple and it's overlapping. We do need a different types of economics, and I think it's an economics that is definitely beyond GDP. It's an economics that starts to look at where we also need particular degrowth in society, but what I mean by degrowth, it's a planned reduction of the economy. And by that, I don't mean a recession, which is unplanned and destructive, and which what capitalism often leads to, which is recessions. But it's actually having a planned downscale of the economy in the industries and sectors that we know are no longer helpful for us, which is things around military emissions, which is around fast fashion in some cases, which is around destructive agricultural practices, which is around practices and laws and systems and mechanisms, like the way that real estate is designed, which we simply cannot keep sustaining generation upon generation, and where we're organizing around promoting the growth of sectors and industries that we know are beneficial for humanity, like healthcare, education, and other ways. And I think doing that in a way where we also take away the growth imperative, I think is important, because often growth can be helpful in some cases, but I think growth as this be-end and end-all as like de facto goal doesn't lead us to society that really is fit for the future.
Here, there's again, we will butt heads on this, because I believe inherently it is in our nature. It is to grow, right? And I think to counter that and to say, hey, you know what, we should be satisfied on the level of living standards that we currently have or whatever, isn't one feasible, and B, isn't in our nature. You know, when you were talking about this, the thought came into my mind. I recently read about a stabbing in Japan. No, sorry, in France, and it was Japanese tourists that were being stabbed and robbed. And when asked the robbers why, they said, why do they get to have nice watches? Why do they get to have nice handbags? It is in our very essence. It is in our soul that we want. We want.
It's deep. It's in our soul.
It is in our DNA. We want. And there's nothing wrong with wanting. I fall all for it. And if we can build mechanisms and systems that help to allow that growth and allow that expansibility without having to be like, hey, you know what, we're capped on our resources, then all the for it. And you know what, in a free market, it will happen. It's again and again. We will see it. And I look at it from a global perspective. When we are in a time when there's least amount of wars ever. We live in a world where we are living in the best human condition that has ever occurred throughout history.
Yeah.
More often than not, we look back and we go, oh, it's doom and gloomy. But in reality, we're doing pretty fucking well. We're at least, I mean, now with Russia and Ukraine, with the US, we're kind of worried about Cold War again. Little bit. Yeah. It's kind of bubbling on the surface, right? But I think that comes back to the original thing, is that there wasn't enough merchants and connections of trade happening within those collective, because as long as it's more cost effective to be peaceful than in be at war, we will always be peaceful. That's it. If it makes more sense economically, because people always think about their dollar amount, right? And my problem with the cronyism that we have now is that it's easier to be a billionaire than it is to be a millionaire.
Yeah.
In the sense of how businesses are now structured, especially in the West, it's set up to be purchased. It's not set up to be run.
Okay.
Right? And so you'll find a lot of these SMEs who will tell you, we're building this because we feel that it would be a great addition to Amazon, or it would be a great addition to Apple. It would be a great addition to Microsoft. That's a problem. Yeah. That's a problem.
Yeah.
And that's... And capitalism as a whole, it doesn't matter how communistic or whatever system you operate under, it's still capitalistic in its decision making, right? Capitalism still exists in communism. It's just done in the state.
I know. I mean,
yeah, you get what I mean. Yeah.
No, but I mean, often if you look at communism, it is still very growth centered. It's very growth focused. Like you can look at Russia. Under the old USSR, they were as growth-centric and focused as anyone.
But very mismanaged.
No, but of course, very mismanaged. But it's part of it is that it's the growth imperative that was still, whether it's under capitalism or communism, when that's there, when it's growth at all costs, when it's growth at the cost of labor rights, when it's growth at the cost of the environment, when it's growth at the cost of actually the well-being of society as a whole, that is a problem. And, you know, I think in the point of, what was I going to say? Oh God, I've blanked.
Don't look at me. I didn't know what's in your mind.
Lala, there was a point that you were mentioning.
Communism, capitalism, expansion of people's wants and needs, being stabbed.
Yeah. Thank you. I was gonna say, and around, I think the wants and needs. It's an interesting question, and you were saying it's so deep in people's soul. I think let's talk about the soul.
Sure.
Anna, for a moment. And I think part of that is also, is that really in our DNA?
I think so.
And if it is in our DNA, and you can look at spiritual theory around, we all have our light and our shadow. We all have our darkness as well within us. And what is society that brings out more of our goodness than others? And it is true that in the form of society that we have, the type of hyper-consumerist society that we have, type of marketing that we have, when you're going on Instagram and social media, there is a very particular view of this is what you should be valuing in life. This is what is important. This is where your worth as a human being is inherently tied to, in watches and other things like that. For me, that's something that is, yes, maybe a seed within us, but is certainly being watered and overwatered. That is people are being incentivized and they're kind of internalizing that type of, this is what matters in society. You can look at equally other societies that don't do that, different communities where they have a different set of values and value set, where owning the watch isn't the most important thing, but being a good friend is the most important thing. And then you have a very different type of community and society.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Do you think men buy a Porsche car or a nice watch because they like the item?
You tell me, do you have a Porsche car?
No.
Okay.
I fundamentally believe we purchased it in order to attract mates. I think that is at the core of the issue, right? Luxury goods is the signal to potential mates, hey, you know what, procreate with me, because your chance of your child, your child having a better life.
Yeah.
And I think there is a large corn of truth to that. Of course, now things have changed slightly. Women obviously have their own income sources and so are more able to be independent. But the old adage of the gold digger exists for a reason.
But do you not think that is then also still exploitative? That's something in which as hyper-capitalism has looked at...
To the men or to the women?
Both.
Both.
No, both.
I think they know what they're getting into.
But it's exploitation on both forms. It's the oppression of someone feeling that is what I need to feel worthy. That is what I need to attract someone. And that, to, I think, be in that type of mindset, to be in that space of that's the outlook and the worldview that you have, for me is a very sad one. Actually, it's something in which fundamentally at your core is an oppressive worldview that's been kind of imposed on you and that you've internalized. It's not something that I think, for me, can really lead to a deeper and long-lasting happiness. Because it is depending on externalities. On the other side, it's companies taking advantage of this kind of gene that you kind of may say
selfish gene,
in a way which is extremely harmful. And those are the things where I think regulation is a good thing, as well around advertising, around what we actually are pushing. But it's a larger form of internalized capitalism for me, around our inherent self-worth being tied to our consumption, where actually when we look at what are the roots of real human happiness, when we look at all the psychological studies that are done, humans are content at a certain point, and once you start to build that wealth beyond that, it doesn't lead to more happiness, so to speak.
Here's where I'll push back with you on a little bit on this. First, I feel like we've been going back and forth
on the same thing. It's like the same. It's like no matter what the topic, Yani,
it's amazing. I love it, Habibi. I love it. You have no idea how happy I am that I have this opportunity. Again, where you just brought up the worldview about being sad and oppressive in that sense. I would say man needs purpose. And it doesn't do good for a population of a lot of young men who don't have a job. I warn you right now, that breeds instability and that breeds war. It reads eternal civil war.
Of course, you need a job. Yeah.
So it is the more human beings are able to confine themselves into an activity, the more you can give yourself an identity. If you're a watchmaker, I'm a watchmaker.
Yeah.
If you're whatever, a race driver, I'm a race driver.
Yeah.
That gives purpose. That gives fulfillment.
Yeah.
Maslow's hierarchy of needs at the very peak is what? Self-fulfillment, right? And so the very best of what you can be, the very best of who you can be, is by being the best at your job. And that's what I truly believe in the end of the day, is that if you can focus all your energy into doing one thing.
Yeah.
And that's why Japan, for example, rewards that culture. No matter if you're profitable or not, if you are the best toy maker,
Yeah.
that's respectable from society.
Yeah.
If you're the best cleaner, that's respectable from
Absolutely.
society. And there's truth to that.
But that's a very different thing than being the best at your craft and profession and art.
One would say that's almost greedy.
I wouldn't. I wouldn't. I mean, but it's a good point, because there's a difference between it's that and the pursuit of excellence, the pursuit of who you are as a human being and your deepest potential, and expressing that in a form that is not greedy, where you can be the watchmaker and create beautiful, beautiful watches. There's nothing wrong with that. But then if you're taking the next step of watchmaking with minerals that are oppressing people, that are tied to the destruction of the environment, that is built off slave trade and labor, there's a very big difference between those two things.
You're putting a lot of intention behind that guy.
But one can be a watchmaker without being imposing the oppression of time across everyone, so to speak. I think there's a difference between that and also what I'll push back against Maslow as well, because Maslow was also known to have appropriated actually a larger indigenous worldview that Maslow built his theory on. And actually what is often misappropriated as self-actualization, the self really in its original form was a larger sense of self.
Okay.
It was a self that was tied to community, of your wider community, and of the natural world. Maslow took that and individualized it. But actually the original theory was far based on a wider sense of I am because you are. I cannot exist unless you exist. My happiness is I can only go so far unless also I'm in a community and an external environment that is allowing that thriving.
I mean, whenever you say this, the old adage pops in my head, is that the road to hell is paved on good intentions, right? And so I believe it is above me to decide what is good and what is bad. I operate by the law, and I try to do whatever I believe is the best that I can do, right? And if it turns out to be good, great. And if it turns out to be bad, well, sucks. That is what it is. You know, I don't get to have a say on how it's interpreted in the future, right? That's like one venue of it. And the other venue, what I dislike about that idea of community is that we've gone through it already. We've had it for the past 2,000 years.
Yes.
Right? It's only since the 1884 Industrial Revolution did individuality even appear. Prior to that, your last name was tied to your profession. That's why you have a lot of people who have a last name like Steinbauer or something like that, because that's what they did. And if you were born as a family of Einschmied, like metal workers, you were going to be a metal worker. There was no other opportunities in life at that point. And when you go back to the feudal states of how Europe was set up, you wouldn't even be able to go from one village into another village without having the paperwork necessary from your governor or your mayor from that town. It was incredibly oppressive. And there was no capitalism there because you were a product of the state. You were owned and you were either a serf or you were a peasant.
Which are the roots of capitalism when it also came to enclosures.
No, I don't think that's the root. Capitalism freed us from that venue.
I'm not. I wouldn't say it freed us per se. I mean, it also goes into because it's also the
Danny,
roots.
can I have my coffee? Go ahead. Sorry.
It's also the roots of growth. It's the roots of enclosure. It's the roots of extractivism that then carried over into a capitalist form of organizing society. So I think there are roots to it where the imperative of growth then comes from, and then how growth is imposed on the basis of corrupt practices.
Do you not feel that capitalism focuses on the individuality?
I think that's its problem.
I think that's its beauty.
Yeah, that's where that should be like the essence of this conversation. This is where we sit down and we disagree.
This is honestly, I've never had this much fun in months and months and months. Habibi, I can't tell you how happy I am.
I'm glad, but I also trust that the seed of doubt has been planted within you.
No.
Slowly, as you're sipping that coffee, it'll be watered. I mean, I do think, Yani, even on a longer term, community is what will get us through.
I believe it's individuality's abilities that will be able to shape our world.
And I don't think there's any such thing as a real individual in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't live alone in our apartments, devoid of anything or anything else. The chair that you're sitting on is both a human and more than human construct, and it's materials that are people have put a lot of care into creating this chair to deliver the electricity that's coming in, that's powering these lights.
Absolutely.
The energy that's coming through from the air conditioning.
Absolutely.
The workers that have, with their heart and their effort and their labor, built this building that we're in.
Absolutely.
We can say individual, but actually we live in nothing but a community life.
And it was paid all to them individually, which is also beautiful to it.
But paid into individually how?
Well, everyone who you purchase a chair from, or the building, or the table, or the electricity, every worker gets that paycheck slip, right? So your direct contribution goes directly to them, right? There's that saying, right? You can't move water in a cup without leaking it. Oh, sorry, you can't move water from one bucket to another without having some spillover or leakage, right? And so that's normal.
But then who owns the bucket?
You invent the bucket, you get to own the bucket.
I don't know. But for me, that's, I think, where my worldview kind of comes in. And I think it informs economics, it informs how we operate as organizations, it's what we kind of work towards. And it's one in which you're saying like it's deep in our soul. And I think there's something around the human spirit that when it's connected to community, it's, our Islamic values, our practices are all around the community, and there's a reason for that. There's a reason why we're organized in such a way. It's the reason why our deen is organized around such a concept. And I think it's one in which, even for our own spiritual liberation, our spiritual life, it's one that is important. But also, I think it's just more. If I'm someone who thinks in systems, you can't think in a system if you just think as an individual. You think that everything is interconnected, and you mentioned kind of even earlier before around, kind of look at nature wants to grow. You're sort of saying that, and actually, nature also has its limits of growth depending on where it is. If a tree wanted to be the most efficient at photosynthesis, its leaves would be black, but it's not black because actually what's important is not the maximization of that one individual leaf, but it's how it operates in the balance across its whole entire ecosystem, what serves itself, but also it can only really serve itself if it starts to give back to the mycorrhiza fungal roots, where it's able to serve the insects that are also benefiting from it, where it's nourishing that ecosystem. And if trees on a longer term, it's, you're saying that's how communities, that's how human society was organized around, and there's a reason for that, because the community model is usually a sustainable model in the long run.
And if trees weren't competitive, they wouldn't be trying to grow at the highest peak, and they would rather spread each other out equally in order to maximize the gain of light. But they compete.
They both compete and collaborate, and it's a balance. And as a forest, as an ecosystem, they collaborate.
One of the biggest issues what you find with deforestation is actually because there's too many trees in one. So what happens is this, right? So if you're looking at like a hillside, right, and then you have a bunch of trees on the hillside, because of the soil degradation from the tree roots, as rain increases, you end up with a landslide that occurs because of just too many tightly packed trees in that routine area, right? And so that's the argument of deforestation is to help spread out those tree sets.
I would say the term isn't deforestation because that's a very specific practice.
I'll concede on the term.
No. So what I'll say, there's a difference between what you mentioned around like deforestation, which is you're going there, you're logging, you're intentionally kind of raising and cutting down entire forests for the purposes of using
for
logging,
resources, sure,
etc. And then what you kind of mentioned is an example of where you need forest management, and where earlier I said actually natural ecosystems are sometimes better off when humans, and particularly traditionally it's been indigenous communities that have come in and have ethically and sustainably looked at forest management, that are saying actually yes, this is why you need, there's a profession called tree surgeons, where they go in and they actually look at an ecosystem and say actually yes, maybe there is going to be
I'm with
kind
you.
of landslide and all of that, and that's not from a mode of extraction, that's a mode of ensuring the ecosystem is actually thriving. And it's a very, very big difference between those two kind of practices.
Habibi, you won't, like, I would say about 80% to 70% of what we say, we are both on the same agreement. It's just
it's the Milton Friedman thing.
It's just how to execute it. Like with the deforestation, I'm with you 100%. I believe it's a great business model to cut trees and to regrow them. I think it's a fantastic business model. Right, I think you're providing a natural habitat for potential animals, and at the same time you're being profitable while being able to operate in a sustainable fashion. I believe from a pure capitalistic point of view, it's a great mechanism. But for that to occur, negative externalities need to be punished.
Yep.
And how that is punished, whether you say from climate change in that you fund then technology that is carbon capturing. But if you do that, businesses then complain and say, hey, you know what? Our tax dollars are being spent on potential products that we don't really want, because we could be designing these products, we could be fulfilling that item, but you're not giving us the chance to do so. There's that kind of counter narrative, right? I mean, the US tried it with carbon coins, right? Where they would have a carbon tax, and it would, every company, if you cut commission, you get that coin, which you can then leverage against your tax code, right? And what happened was that you'd have like these very renewable companies, like Tesla's, for example, would sell these coins to other more polluters. So I don't know if there's a simple solution on it other than bringing down the hammer.
And sickle?
Maybe.
Yeah, but I was gonna say, I mean, even those kinds of mechanisms, and I mean, the carbon markets are very underdeveloped at the moment. It is still also very much race to the bottom. It is very much greenwashing, as they are now, because it's still in this mode of towards increasing economic growth. It's actually not there to serve, I think, the core purpose of what they were designed to do, which is help a just transition to renewable energy, to public infrastructure that is in sync with the environment, and for a larger kind of sustainable well-being commons. Like these are kind of individual tools that are actually not serving any of those purposes, and actually it's the opposite. It's because they're being implemented often by companies that are profit-centric, where they have often failed.
I think where the root of the problem lies is that there's a misalignment of goals between executives or board or CEO or whatever level, and at the end of the day, the foot soldiers. And the misalignment is that, you know, a good board sets plans for about 25 years. 10 to 25 years. If you're a good board, if you're a bad board, you do 5 years. Because there's issues if you're doing it that mechanism. But what happens is that you have a board that has an intention or value or aim or objective for 25 years. You have then the general managers and the supervisors having to show quarterly growth because their ability to get promoted, to move up in that hierarchy is set in a very specific time frame, right?
Exactly.
It's not like we're saying to that person, hey, listen, you're going to be stuck in this position for 5 years. And if you do good in these 5 years, we're going to put you into vice president position, right? In reality, you've got every year, you have to show what you've done.
Yep.
And so you end up with this weird clash where a lot of the times decisions are done for the short-term gain rather than the long-term gain. But that's because there's a misalignment.
Absolutely.
I don't believe it's nefarious in any sense. Or that capitalism is at fault at this. This is humans being bad.
I mean, it's also the incentives to be successful under the system of capitalism as well. I mean, it's partly connected to that. But I agree, it is a misalignment of, I think, of objectives, and it's a misalignment when it comes to, even when you look then at the wider sphere of between government and what government feels would be serving public infrastructure and services, whether healthcare, education, others, and there's even more misalignment. And then you go to the outer layer of ecologically as well, and just the biosphere and the biophysical reality that we live in. And then there's even more misalignment when it comes to that.
Well, especially when we talk about the food industry, right? There's so much cronyism going on, that you're not allowed to film slaughterhouses, for example. That's crazy.
Yeah.
That you can be sued if you take pictures of what they're feeding the animals.
Yeah.
That's crazy, right? And I think that's where real government oversight needs to step in, and you have to push the market. You have to clean up a lot of this mess so that it is profitable for smaller farming communities to exist.
Yeah.
Right, but the cronyism has reached to such a far degree that if farmers use, so this is a very specific use case. In the US, seeds are bioengineered, and they're set up as a yearly growth cycle, meaning that if you get caught planting last year's seeds in your farm, you can be sued up the wazoo. And that needs to be addressed majorly. And that's where the failure of cronyism happened, right?
And it's a failure around, I think, also how we think of IP, especially when it comes to natural assets, so to speak. I mean, even that example of the seed, there's examples in India of a large company patenting an indigenous seed. And in the process of patenting it and then bioengineering it, didn't allow the farmers who've been planting this particular seed for centuries and centuries to use it again. So when a community then comes and plants it, something they've planted for generations in their family, they're then getting cease and desist letters.
Cronyism. That's all it is.
And the fact that is allowed, the fact that kind of extractivism is something that is celebrated as an investment in technology and innovation it's a problem. And it's a problem that pervades itself across not just the food system, but across many, many others as well.
Well, I mean, if we look at it from a larger perspective again, or a macro perspective, the stuff that you find in the supermarket, none of it is nature's intent, right? I mean, Dan, can you look up what the picture is for the original watermelon?
Oh, look at the banana. I always find the banana is interesting.
Watermelon, avocados.
Yeah.
All of these. None of that was even mangoes.
Yeah.
Original watermelon.
Oh, those are just original watermelon recipes that look they look really really delicious.
Yeah, that's how the original watermelon looked like. Right there on the left, Danny. Do you see it?
The ancient origins of watermelon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It wasn't anywhere near as sweet as it is today. It's all changed.
Yeah. And there's a difference between
kettle as well, by the way. And chickens, we bred them for thousands of years.
And there's a difference between, when it comes to fruits and vegetables kind of breeding, and there's a difference between when you have that type of cronyism where you're starting to patent and actually where you're stopping communities from planting particular seeds and crops, because you then end up with a food system that is completely overtaken by private capture. And food, as what I believe should be a right, is no longer something that can be really enshrined and accessible to communities.
It's a very difficult process on how it's managed. I don't believe you should be able to be at a restaurant and order a steak for 10 BD. I don't think that should not be possible. Just from the overhead of what it would cost the restaurant to how much that cow actually is worth, that doesn't feasibly make sense to me in my head. Most of the animals we eat is actually sick. Feeding cattle grain, it makes them diabetic. It puts fat storages, so you're eating a sick animal, and we're poisoning ourselves in that aspect. And that's that's pure cronyism. And the same occurred with back. Me and you lived through this cycle of the war on fat. And how we pushed entire society on sugar. Yet somehow, if that was true, why do we have an epidemic of obesity, right? And this comes back to the case. And on the larger scale, now see, this is where the conspiracy part of me comes out. I look at that climate change.
All of this wasn't the conspiracy part. Now we're getting to the conspiracy
now.
All right.
The aspect of when you told me 99% of scientists believe that climate change is man-caused, and then I look at sugar or fats, then I look at what we've been told.
The nutrition. The nutrition industry, I think, is something else completely. The nutrition industry. And I'm not a nutritionist. I've sat, many talks I've attended as well by Nutrition Bahrain will kind of just go around. This is where science and corporate capture, I think, comes in. Because you can look at any fact that's maybe nutritionally, you can see and search on the internet. Then you'll find another study that'll confirm and tell you the complete opposite.
Sure.
And it's a very particular thing in that industry where when you start to go to the roots of any study and find, but it's actually funded by this company and that company, it's more prevalent, I think, almost in the dietary and food and nutrition sector than any other. The one, even the less than 1% of studies in the climate world that have a cast doubt on climate change are funded by the fossil fuel industry.
Come on. Fossil fuel is the biggest funders for climate change activities.
I'm saying the ones that actually discount are the ones that actually are kind of those core funding where it's there to put sort of seeds of doubt. But that is less of an issue in the climate space where the science is far more comprehensive than, I think, nutrition and diet and food, where the idea of you're in a post-normal science world is, I think, very prevalent. And the post-normal science concept is, you're doing science now in a world, in an age where facts are up for debate, where it's extremely politicized, where science, academia, and corporate capture and cronyism are so intertwined that it's sometimes hard to intermesh and to disentangle. And that you can justify almost anything through a scientific study if you pay enough for it when it comes to certain industries like nutrition and others. I've heard many nutritionists complain, obviously, of that fact that even when you start to study that as a field, it's so complex because you're being told the truth and the opposite and the truth, and you're not quite sure what's real and what's not real.
Sure.
And it's an extremely murky field to kind of navigate in.
But it's not. Let's not kid ourselves. It's not just nutritionists. BP, when they had that oil spill, the engineers told them you cannot put water there. It will cause a rupture. And they themselves said no. Just make it happen. So it's not that. The problem, I think, in a larger scope is that we don't believe in our institutions anymore because they have failed miserably. And then you kind of get pushed on the offset of being, you're a science denier, when you're like, no, I just don't trust you. I just don't trust the institution anymore. And that's the scary part, right? where you're kind of stuck in a situation where you're reading Nature or American Scientific and you go,
Yeah. And you look at who are the people, who are the researchers, who are their funders, where is those roots, and yeah, it's a difficult thing to.
By the way, I don't know if you know this, but when researchers first went to study penguins, they wrote it in ancient Greek.
What?
They wrote it in ancient Greek.
Okay.
Because I don't know how I feel about that, but they wrote it in ancient Greek because they didn't want the public to be shocked on how cruel penguins are.
Penguin society.
They are horrible. They are horrible. From necrophilia, everything. They are like terrible animals. But they wrote their research papers in ancient Greek for only the scientific community. Can you look it up, Dan? You gave me that look of doubt. I'll show it to you.
No, I was just thinking. I wonder what the penguins think of us.
I don't think they're capable of that level of self-awareness.
I wonder what the penguins think of a penguin club.
Yeah, that's another problem. You've heard of that, didn't you?
No, I haven't.
Oh, that was like a pedophile ring.
You somehow come back to this in your podcast quite.
We do.
But was this in Greek? No, it's not in Greek.
No, they wrote it. They wrote their annotations in Greek.
Oh, interesting. But yeah, I think it's also, again, it's still our human interpretation of their laws and their moral code and their ethics. And
I don't think they have those things, moral code and ethics.
Well, no, I said it's our imposition.
Sure, our imposition.
It's like our imposition.
I agree with that.
On them and not taking species for their own particular unique communities and how they operate and what the rules are. And some were able to figure that out behaviorally, and some were still figuring out what the systems are.
And what do you think of people like Alex Jones?
Alex Jones,
Can you type in climate change? Alex Jones. He built a whole. Does he want to show up in Google article?
Go to images, please. Oh, that Alex Jones.
Alex Jones.
The guy who went broke now because he was sued by the Sandy Hook.
I don't know if he's broke. I think.
Oh no, he was. I forgot what it was like.
He transferred his company's assets to another entity, so he can claim bankruptcy. So he wouldn't have to.
You don't have to. But that's liable. The same. That's the same guy.
Yes, that's the same guy. They're trying to sue him for 3.2 trillion now. That's another issue that needs to be rectified.
Rectified in what sense?
I mean, that's an astronomical amount. That's the GDP size of France. How can you have a lawsuit for defamation of 3.2 trillion? I mean, how can you have
But it's the same guy who basically terrorized the Sandy Hook family victims. That's the guy.
Yes, I don't know if I mean, I don't think he.
That's why he was.
Yes. But let's.
Not going to take so much.
No. You labeled him very specifically right there, and you know exactly what you did. He claimed
Alex Jones damage to society.
He claimed he named one person, I think,
more terrifying than Trump.
I don't think he's more terrifying than
Trump.
No,
that's what it says down on the left. Yeah, I'm not sure I would take his climate change theories seriously, but I haven't heard his views on climate change. But I can only assume, my friend, that there's a very specific intersection.
I mean, I would. I'll send you some stuff of his over.
I'm not going to promise to watch any of that, my friend.
Oh, come on. Don't be closed-minded. What is this? You should be open. What happened to
You know, there's some things it's like you're aware of, but also I think you also need to be careful about what you kind of take in. I think you can be open enough to understand and have empathy and to understand a different point of view. But I think as soon as it starts to go into hate speech and it goes into right-wing,
we're going to crash on this as well.
All of that, I think it's a personal choice of like the type of content that you want to spend your time on.
Yes, but
as well.
okay.
And there's a fine balance being aware and open and
Sure.
And then also just
But we have to deconstruct these parts, right? I mean, when you're talking about, first of all, hate speech isn't a thing. It doesn't exist. It's speech. It's freedom of speech. Where you then call to action, that's what's illegal.
okay.
So if I say, you know, fuck Dan,
But it's legally
that's
called-
fine.
But there's legal terms around hate speech and legal.
But that's dangerous. That's so dangerous when you start having that dialogue, because what is deemable hate speech today not necessarily is a reflection of future. The word faggot, for example, is a cigarette in the UK. However, it is a very different connotation in the US. The word cunt, which is a very different connotation in the US, in the UK means an idiot.
And there's also at scale when you're anti-Semitic too.
That's easy. That's a whole different thing again.
But that's the same. But Alex Jones is the same guy as well.
I don't think he's anti-Semitic. He might be. I don't know.
Can you please
Danny, look it up. Researcher. Is Danny Alex Jones anti-Semitic? We're gonna be put on a watch list. That's Kanye West. Can you scroll down?
There you go.
The first link, and you believe it immediately from a website called Spectre.org.
No. I was thinking if it's the same. If it's the same guy. Indeed, it is.
I mean, Alex Jones, Times of Israel.
Yeah, I have no.
Nothing with Alex Jones so far.
Oh no! Literally, the first ones all were.
No, that was Kanye West.
La.
لا طالع. Which one?
Alex Jones debates the Jewish questions.
I mean, that doesn't make him.
The InfoWars host and internet-fueled conspiracy theorist goes off about the Jewish mafia.
Is that true, or is that just tabloid.mag?
I don't know. Anyway, I mean, listen, you're far more knowledgeable on Alex Jones in that world than I am.
I love that dude.
I leave it to you. No comment on in my world, my friend. Yeah.
I mean, we went far off track here.
Do you want to be the Alex Jones of Bahrain? Is
Absolutely.
That what you're... Ooh.
Absolutely.
Ooh, wow. Oh, wow.
I think absolutely. If I
do you have the GDP of China to spend on the incoming lawsuits?
I think at that point I'll have to move and change names. I'll have to put on a mustache, or maybe shave my bearded mustache. No, I don't like بالحقيقة, I don't know how the world will look like in that sense. There is interesting shit that happens. There's crazy stuff that happens. I don't know where the line to that is or isn't, and how it has to be portrayed. Because I mean, it's dangerous when you look at like the New York Times or the Guardian. Who owns Amazon? Owns which newspaper? Washington Post, and they all have a collective narrative. Once reporting becomes like a coversion, where they're like, hey, you know, this is the dialogue we're pushing, that's what becomes really, really dangerous.
Yeah, it does.
And that's what we're seeing at the moment. I mean, the stuff like for example, the White House told Twitter to ban doctors that were worried about giving the COVID vaccine.
Okay. I didn't hear about that.
Exactly, right? And that was underreported because of specific reasons. The EU the EU just questioned Pfizer for on allegations. It was just recently in the news. And Pfizer came out and admitted that the vaccine, they knew that the vaccine didn't stop infection.
Yes.
But they marketed it that it would.
Okay.
That was one of the key dialogues around it, saying, hey, you know, even if you're not worried about getting COVID, you should get it because you're saving your grandparents or you're saving your parents. And that's the stuff that gets really, really like scary. What would you like? Content-wise, what kind of exposure would you want? What would be your dream?
I mean, I was very happy that you said that you're thinking of doing a female-centric show.
Sure.
'Cause I think with female-centric, it is also exploring gender, I think is a broader issue. And I also think that there is a need for more engagement of men, I think, on this topic as well, that it's a show that's also able to explore femininities as much as it is masculinities, I think, in its sense. And I think more of that kind of space and discussion is welcome, and I'm happy to hear that you're heading in that direction.
It's a difficult... We have this discussion a lot with girls, and I go, you can't have the good without having the bad, right? I mean, you can't say, I want equal treatment and equal opportunity, and then be surprised when you're getting grabbed by the bus, be surprised when people don't want to defend you walking on the street. I mean, I was speaking to my friends in the UK, in London, and I was talking to her about it, and she was telling me at the moment she doesn't go outside her house to walk her dog.
Yeah.
At night. You know, she lets her boyfriend do that. When she does walk in and off of a bus station, she puts her keys into her fist. So if somebody would like grab her or something like that she would be able to scratch him. And you know, you go to a club and you get called bitch, you get called this, you get called that. This is not part of our society. If somebody says in a club or in a bar and somebody yells like that bitch or something like that, the whole place stops. Like they're like, this is something big happened. But in the UK, you know, nobody even bats an eyelid. It's not a big thing. And you know, here, if you touch a girl and she makes a scene, the pace like stops.
Of course.
But in
as it should do.
Listen, I'm not arguing against it. I'm saying in the UK, no one really cares. No one cares. You get filled up in buses. You get filled up in clubs. And that's the price you pay. You know, you can't.
The price you pay for what?
I think if you I think it's safe to say that here in Bahrain or the GCC, we do hold women almost like a princess.
Okay.
In the sense that we see them. No, I don't want to say them as an object, but we wrap them almost like in bubble. Do you not get what I'm saying? Like we're very, like the way we treat women is very respectful. Which
I think is core to our principles also
as a nation, as a culture.
As a culture in Islam as well.
Absolutely.
Respect for any human being, and especially the respect and rights for women. At the same time, I also don't think that even in the UK, that for me isn't the price. Like there isn't a trade-off, or there shouldn't be a trade-off between you have your rights, you're respected, your freedoms, and this is the cost of it. Also because even when those freedoms weren't there, even when it was the suffragettes and the suffragette movement, they still didn't have those freedoms either. So for me, it's not like one equals two.
Come on, 1940s, the way men treated women was very different than the 1980s or even now the 2000s. I mean, we can be very honest on this when we talk about the West. You just have to look at how old movies treat the dialogue that was spread, and you can ask the older generation.
I mean, dialogue is one thing, but then when you're talking about your right to vote, your right to own property, your right to play sports, your right to go outside without kind of permission, all of those things were not afforded. Your right to work in many industries.
Sure.
All of that wasn't there. Like no matter how much it may seem in kind of dialogue, I think externally, then it's something that wasn't a core to those societies.
But I mean, when we're talking about the right
like
to vote,
even like it was an interesting thing with the England.
Danny, can you give me my ashtray and my cigarettes? Thank you. But
even with I was just gonna say, even in the UK, there was an interesting dialogue that happened around the women's football team.
Sure.
Where they won the Euros for the.
Okay, perfect.
I think it was the Euros for the first time. And there was this kind of conversation around, should should the women's football team be paid the same amount as the men? Then obviously kind of the different debates around it, but how much money do they bring in, the sector, the industry, and of course there's more money in the men's game than there are the women's game. And where the conversation eventually went in that debate was, yes, but also women were banned from playing football professionally for decades. It was something which the very industry was outlawed, and the men's game had far longer to build its commercialization, its industry, etc. And it doesn't mean that once that's allowed and people are now allowed to vote, to participate in industry, to have their equal voice, that should come at the cost of you not even feeling safe to go outside. Relax, for me, it's a sign of more work needs to be done. And I've also heard my friends here say the same when they go out in Bahrain and in certain areas where they're catcalled, and it's not that. Yeah.
By the way, sorry to interrupt you. There's a law right now being put into place in Bahrain, 100 BD fine,
which is
for catcalling,
which is good and is the bare minimum of what should be in place. And for me, it's not this is the cost of your freedom, but actually you're only really in your liberty when you're safe in your country, when you're able to go out safely at any time of the day, when you don't have to worry about those types of things in the workplace and public society. Actually, for me, it shows we have a lot more work to do.
But here's where I stand against you on this. One, I don't think men or women are the same. I think we are different. Biologically, mentally, our goals are different alignments, right? You can look at Scandinavia that has done more than any other nation in the world, that have equalized it as much as possible. And what have you find? When you equalize things as much as you can, you increase the biological differences. There are more men engineers in Scandinavia than anywhere else, and there's more female nurses than anywhere else, and there is a root cause to this. We cannot say, in society, hey, you know what, we all have the same skill sets, we all have the same everything. It's not. You get the luck of the trade. Some people are good at music, some people are good at math. It is what it is. And the same is true with gender. I mean, there are, I'm not saying that a female can't win against a man, but I'm saying, when you look at it as a whole picture on boxing, guys tend to do better. That does not necessarily mean that there cannot be a female world champion who cannot defeat all guys. But the probability is stacked in your favor.
But those are different. I mean, those are different sports.
Chess is the same thing, by the way.
There's different sports, but I'd also say, one for a different kind of podcast completely. But I think there's an illusion of what the Scandinavian model is, and I don't think it's one that's really as democratic, as equal as what I think it's portrayed to be. You can speak to the many Arab and immigrant communities that are there now, suffering from structural racism, how society is designed there. But yeah, a topic for a different time.
I'd love to have you back on, dude, if you want to. But I'm worried that you're like, hey, you know what? That was too much for me.
He's like, I'm stepping into my Alex Jones phase now, my friend. I'm fully there.
But
I think there's on that one side, but for me there's a difference between you're talking around kind of sports or something where men and women are competing with one another. There's something that's there that's different, and there are different kinds of sports, different forms of sports. To the very fundamental question of, okay, but that still doesn't mean that in a inclusive society that we can't have a situation where everyone, men and women are included, are safe from harassment, where they're treated equally, where their rights are enshrined. That also has nothing to do with that kind of wider spectrum of any biological difference. That should be a standard for all human beings.
Sure, but I mean, this is talking about a perfect world situation. I mean, you expose yourself to risk by your actions, right?
Yeah.
And that both is from women and for men, right? If you go into a bad neighborhood with your car, that's on you, right? If you walk at night in a bad neighborhood, that's also partly on you. It sucks, but you have to have also part of responsibility on this. And to say that society should be respectful and should be safe, I'm all for it. I'm not arguing against it, but you cannot be delusional about it either.
But also women aren't delusional about it, because you just gave the example of your friend who thinks twice, obviously, around going out. We know that when women go into an Uber, they text their friends and they send the notification of, you can track my ride, just to make sure that they're home safe.
That's the world we live in.
That's unfortunately the world that we live in now, and you'd hope it's the world that we work to be out of. And it's one in which inequality comes in many different forms, and that's also one of them, because there's this concept as well around time inequality, because actually men therefore have far more opportunity to exercise and to move than women do, just because of that kind of one thing. Women actually have to spend more time avoiding all these different places, to think twice, to do all these precautions that men also don't have to do. And there's a cost towards that. It's not an efficient model as well. If you are in a shareholder capitalism perspective, actually it's far better to have a rights-based model as well that really enshrines that, because then people are more in their freedom and their liberty.
Well, here is where ideology meets fact,
and
right?
Also, just apologies, I do have to.
Sure. Let me know. You want to go now?
We can finish this point.
Okay, I was just going.
I have a family member who's kind of waiting.
Sorry. Sorry. I was about to say was when you look at like League of Legends, I could be mistaken for which contest it was, but I think it was
League of Legends.
League of Legends. It's like a video game, and Saudi Arabia and Bahrain are right now pushing this whole video game esports industry. Long story short, they broke off the matches in gender, meaning they had a women team and they had a males team.
Yeah.
There was a huge backlash on it. And their argument that they presented was saying, listen, if we mix it and we don't take consideration in the gender, there are going to be far fewer females in the competing ring, because it's 25 spots.
Yeah.
And that's just the fact of it. That does not necessarily mean that one of those women can't be in the champion team. It just means that the probability of being a pure female team winning is fewer, and people were basically coming out and calling them liars, and so they did it. And so out of they had two leagues, both with 25. Now they have one league which is 25, and I think there are about 2 or 3 women being able to compete. So you've ruined an entire league, I guess. You've ruined an entire, not league, but you've ruined an entire opportunity for women that would have been able to compete. And that leads onto the bigger picture now, where you're saying, okay, where if you're saying men and women should be able to compete in sports, what do you do then with people who identify them as their own, as the opposite of their gender? Do you allow boxing with a guy who's been a guy for 25 years, who's just gone through a sex reassignment? And then,
I mean, I think.
I don't know.
But I think sports is a whole other. I mean, it's a whole other thing. I mean, sports is also, obviously, it's connected to rights and equality in this conversation, but it's also very separate to,
of course,
how women are able to participate economically in society. The rules and the laws that are ensuring that they also have equal rights to men at every single level of society, as well as also having the rules, the customs, the norms, the laws that ensures that you can go outside and for a walk without worrying for your very life, is a very different conversation to should then men and women be competing. And that depends on sports as well. Serena Williams sort of spoke to, actually you can't compare men and women's tennis because it's almost 2 separate sports. And she talked about how, if she was competing in the men's game, she may not be as successful because it's just a very different kind of sport.
She lost to a guy who was smoking and eating chicken wings.
But I don't know.
Yeah, it was a big story.
But it's a very different kind of sport, I think, in its essence, to compare to when you start to look at gaming, which I find interesting because you start to look into, I'd be interested in a scientific study.
I'll present it to you.
Because I think it's a very interesting cultural thing, because I would start to look at, why is that? Is that also in the roots of when you compare the men and the women and their experiences around gaming, have men been afforded more of the time to game in their life? Are they in family environments where the family are more considered for the guy basically gaming all day and then not allowing the female to game?
I love it.
Is there like a time difference in inequality of where they're allowed to or not? Is it a case of also just culturally where the patriarchy isn't in play and women shouldn't be? But I start to think about like what are actually the reasons, the roots where, yes, okay, it would be important to have your platform for female gamers. So you have that. And also then understanding what are the barriers culturally, time-wise, and all of that come into it. I don't know if like any of that is the case, of course, but I'd be very interested to see where that shows up and how that shows up, because it's just a reflection of society in different forms.
I love that you centered around the sociological issues involving with it, rather than saying, I wonder if there's a biological difference onto it.
No, but the thing, that's where I would start.
Sure.
I'd actually start with where is the playing field not leveled? Where is there just a vast difference in spectrum and structure of inequality that would have led to that in the first place? That's where my mind goes in the first place. Listen, I've been around a lot of guys. We're not so special.
I think we are.
And you just, for me, I think first you go there. First you go to that fundamental. Where are there the root structures and causes of inequality? Let's start there and understand that and start to build that, understand where is that historically, structurally, and where then do we have the pathways, the platforms to help balance and right that in different ways, until, then you can have maybe a question around biologically, and then where you have an experiment where you have two twins as an experiment of boy and girl that are growing up with the same amount of gaming, and then see who's better at the end of it. I don't know if that kind of study has been done, but I'd be very interested to see if that study has been done, and to be repeated across many different kinds of twins and genes. But that's where my mind goes when you start to share those kinds of stories.
I find that absolutely fascinating, Habibi. Dude, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I'd love to have you back on if you're up for it.
It's my pleasure as well. Thank you for the invite.
Come on.